A well-known doctor was brutally attacked in his home. Investigators discovered that telephone traffic near the victim's home increased substantially within seconds of the crime. Those calls, tracked with a sophisticated forensic computer program, uncovered an international conspiracy. Dr. Louis Davidson was one of the most respected pediatricians in St. Petersburg, Florida. At 38 years old, he was head of pediatric emergency medicine at the Bayfront Medical Center.
It was all about the patient, the baby, the toddler, the child. He treated them each with utmost respect. Never a snide comment. And he gave 100% of himself to each child. And he was so smart, he was almost scary.
On January 25, 1994, Dr. Davidson finished his work at the hospital and headed home to get some sleep. Dr. Davidson's girlfriend stopped by his apartment later that day, and this is what she saw.
She had her own key to the apartment, and she used her key to enter the apartment. And as she walked in, she saw this crime scene where stuff was just spewed all over the place. She walked back and found him in the tub.
Dr. Davidson was dead in the bathtub. He had been beaten and apparently drowned.
I knew right away that this wasn't an ordinary suicide or anything like that this was definitely a brutal crime scene.
Detective Mike Salona was assigned to the case. His identity is concealed because he's now working undercover.
The master bedroom closet had obviously been gone through, clothing pulled off hangers, thrown on the floor. However, one of the items that was still in the closet was a garment bag, and in the bottom of the garment bag was $20,000 in cash.
Meaning the motive wasn't robbery. The crime scene had been staged to make it appear to be robbery. Davidson's girlfriend told police that the doctor had been receiving strange telephone calls at home over the past several weeks.
Sometimes they'll come at 3 in the morning, sometimes 4 in the morning. She says that someone calls and then hangs up, looking just to see if there is somebody home in that apartment.
Investigators found their first piece of forensic evidence on a tile floor in the doctor's apartment.
Tile floors are very conducive to leaving evidence, especially shoe prints.
Tile is flat and non-porous, a perfect template for prints. So technicians dusted the area. And just as they expected, a shoe impression appeared. Next, they used a gel pad and pushed the adhesive onto the print, which fixes the dust in position for later analysis.
It was amazing to me that that shoe print was preserved. Normally, that shoe print could have been destroyed in many different ways by detectives and officers and paramedics going in and out of that residence. But somehow that shoe print survived.
The impression was sent to the FBI in Washington, D.C., to their footwear impression department. There, the print was compared to the thousands of shoe impressions on file. FBI experts noticed it was a size 9 sneaker and was new. Their comparisons revealed it was a Voigt brand shoe, a relatively obscure brand. But homicide investigators needed more than one shoe impression to find the killer. Investigators were still processing the crime scene when news of Dr. Davidson's death was released to the media.
It was on the news. And just the way he died was so horrific that it was like too hard to grasp. It was like being in some bad movie, but it was real.
Everything that people look for in a sort of a juicy, almost a soap opera style story was there in this particular murder case.
The doctor's co-workers could think of no one who would want to harm him. But investigators discovered that Dr. Davidson was going through a divorce. His wife, Denise, a former finalist in the Miss Jamaica beauty pageant, was asking for custody of their 8-year-old daughter, something the doctor was resisting. When police told Denise that her husband had been murdered, she appeared to have information that hadn't yet been released to the media.
Here is Denise Davidson asking the detectives that are telling her her husband was found murdered at his apartment. Well, was it a robbery?
Now suspicious, police placed Denise Davidson under 24-hour surveillance.
We're thinking that it was a pager she had called.
3 days later, Denise made an unusual trip.
She walks in and goes to a Western Union. Now, obviously, when she leaves, we walk in right behind her and determine that she's using Western Union, and she sends a money transfer, a $1,200 money transfer.
Denise had used an alias for the transfer, Pauline White. The money was sent to a Robert Gordon in Miami.
It's being sent by a Pauline White, which is not Denise Davidson's name. It's obvious, that's a different name. Fictitious address, fictitious phone number. But we watched her send it.
Robert Gordon was an acquaintance of Miami nightclub owner Leo Cisneros, who also happened to be Denise Davidson's current boyfriend and the father of her unborn child. Cisneros allegedly had ties to Jamaican drug trafficking. Flight records indicated that Leo Cisneros flew to Jamaica on the day of Dr. Davidson's murder. And telephone records indicated that Denise Davidson made numerous calls to Robert Gordon on the morning her husband was murdered.
Between 9:30 in the morning and 11:30 in the morning, a 2-hour period, there are 52 telephone calls made from Denise Davidson's house to Robert Gordon's pager.
Investigators now believed that Denise Davidson knew more about her husband's murder than she admitted, and they asked the court for permission to wiretap her telephone. That order was granted, but it didn't reveal what investigators hoped for.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi, babe.
I called the Western Union place and they said the money is available to be picked up.
You got to remember, Denise Davidson from the beginning knew that her phones may be tapped. So she was careful with what she said and what she didn't say on the phone.
Then, police noticed an irregularity. While Leo Cisneros was in Jamaica, someone was using his cell phone in Florida, and those calls could be easily traced. When someone makes a cell phone call, the signal goes through a series of what are known as cell site towers before it gets to an individual's phone. Police can trace a cell phone call by the identity of the towers the call uses. All of this cell tower and wiretap information is then put into the ACES computer program. ACES stands for Augmented Criminal Investigation Support System.
ACES has not ever been utilized by our police department for homicide investigations. It had been utilized for numerous years by the Intelligence Division, by the Narcotics Division, because they deal a lot with telephone records, wiretaps, large amounts of volumes of people connected to one another.
This computer analysis revealed an important piece of information. Cisneros' cell phone was used on the morning of Dr. Davidson's murder from outside the doctor's apartment. A few hours later, Calls were made from this motel near Dr. Davidson's apartment, and the calls continued while the individual headed south along Highway 60, Route 95, all the way to Miami. The last call that day used a cell tower a few blocks away from Robert Gordon's home. Gordon was the man Denise Davidson had wired $1,200 to a few days after the murder. When police visited the motel near Dr. Davidson's apartment, they discovered Robert Gordon had stayed there around the time of Dr. Davidson's murder.
The maid recalls that there was something left behind in that room. One of their policies at the time was if there were items left behind by a customer, they would put them in a bag with a card that had the date and the room number they were found, and they put them in a storage closet.
The bag contained a sweatshirt and something investigators had been looking for since the day of the murder.
And guess what else we've got? We've got some shoes, sneakers to be exact.
The same size as the impression found in the doctor's apartment. Investigators hoped this chance discovery would solve the murder. Denise Davidson had wired money to Robert Gordon in Miami just days after her husband's murder. Informants in Miami told police that Gordon had an associate, Merrill McDonald, who was with Gordon in St. Petersburg around the time of Dr. Davidson's murder. During questioning, both denied any involvement in the crime. They also denied owning the sweatshirt and sneakers left in their motel room. Technicians compared the shoe impression found on Dr. Davidson's tile floor with the sneakers from the motel. Both were size 9. Both were the obscure Voigt brand, and both were identical in wear patterns. The shoes matched Gordon's shoe size. Next, technicians analyzed the sweatshirt and discovered a number of head hairs, facial hairs, and some foreign fibers. The facial and head hairs were found inside the sweatshirt, not uncommon when someone is taking the garment off over his head. The hairs were unusual since they contained a chemical dye. A chemical analysis of that dye matched the dye found on the head and facial hair of the second suspect, Merrill McDonald.
Mr. McDonald made the mistake of coloring his hair. The FBI lab was able to determine that the type of color used on this strand of hair was consistent with the type of coloring Mr. McDonald uses on his hair.
Scientists also found blue cashmere fibers on the sweatshirt. Those fibers matched the victim's cashmere bathrobe. Finally, and most damning, a DNA analysis of blood found on the sweatshirt and sneakers was that of Dr. Davidson.
One more nail has been put into the coffin of these two defendants, these two men that were hired to kill, that decided that money was more important than life.
But investigators had no solid proof that Denise Davidson was involved in the murder plot. She stood to inherit more than $500,000 from her estranged husband's life insurance policy, as well as gain full custody of their daughter. During hours of police interrogation, Denise insisted she didn't know Robert Gordon and Merrill McDonald and had nothing to do with their husband's murder. Denise was under police surveillance when she went to the Western Union office to transfer money to Robert Gordon. But she signed the receipt using an alias, Pauline White. A forensic handwriting examiner compared the Pauline White signature to known handwriting samples of Denise Davidson. He concluded the same individual signed them both. Forensic technicians tested the receipts for latent or hidden fingerprints. They stained the receipt with ninhydrin, a chemical solution that turns the amino acids in finger oils purple.
we have it processed for fingerprints. And it's Denise Davidson's fingerprints on that piece of paper.
And police found evidence that Denise Davidson purchased a man's gray sweatshirt and a pair of size 9 Voigt sneakers just before her husband's murder, identical to the items found in the motel with her husband's bloodstains. Denise Davidson not only denied any involvement in her husband's murder, she now said she had evidence to prove it.
How much stranger can this case get? You know, how many more twists can this case take?
The forensic evidence clearly placed Robert Gordon and Merrill McDonald inside Dr. Davidson's apartment during his murder.
The two people that were hired to do the killing, Mr. Gordon and Mr. McDonald, didn't know the doctor at all. The reason they took his life was strictly for monetary reasons.
But just as police were about to arrest the victim's estranged wife, Denise, the case took an unexpected turn. Denise told police that the real killer had called her home while she was away and left a threatening message on her telephone answering machine.
We're not available right now, so could you please just leave your name and your telephone number? You'll be sorry, Denise.
But police arrested Denise anyway, just as she was about to board a flight to Jamaica.
I approached her. She sat there waiting for her flight to arrive. She was very surprised when she saw me. And her first words were, "Detective Salerno, what are you doing here?"
In October of 1995, Denise went on trial for soliciting her husband's murder. Denise took the stand in her own defense and told the jury about the threatening telephone call she received from the person she says was the real killer. But prosecutors were ready for her.
You'll be sorry, Denise.
Investigators had traced that call and discovered it had originated from the store where Denise worked. And Denise had been under police surveillance that day.
And I could see in her eyes she knew what was happening. And it almost looked at that time like the air had just been taken out of her.
Prosecutors presented the jury with this surveillance video showing Denise entering the store shortly before the threatening call was placed and leaving just after the call was completed.
When the state attorney directed the question to her as to whether that was her voice on that tape, she could only answer, "I don't think so."
She just listened to it and looked at it and really gave no explanation for who that phone call came from and why it was made.
She was holding up pretty good with her lies through the first portion of her testifying. But from that point on, everything was falling apart.
And I think the jury saw what I saw, and that was fear in the eyes of a lady who hired two men to kill her husband.
Prosecutors believe that Denise asked her boyfriend, Leo Cisneros, to kill her husband. Instead, Cisneros hired Robert Gordon and Merrill McDonald.
Leo Cisneros, the boyfriend, who had no courage, he couldn't commit the crime himself, so he hired the two scarecrows, Robert Gordon and Merrill McDonald, who he said didn't have a brain amongst them.
The two tracked Dr. Davidson for days by calling his apartment, and a witness said they were at the hospital dressed like doctors trying to get Dr. Davidson's schedule. On the day of the murder, Dr. Davidson was running 2 hours late and didn't arrive home until 10 o'clock. This explains why Denise called Robert Gordon's pager 52 times between 8 and 10 o'clock that morning, apparently concerned about why the murder was delayed. When Gordon and McDonald knocked on the doctor's door, he answered in his bathrobe. In the scuffle, Dr. Davidson's robe fibers and blood got on McDonald's sweatshirt, the one Denise had purchased for him. After drowning Davidson in the bathtub, Gordon left his shoe imprint on the tile floor. And when MacDonald removed the sweatshirt, he left evidence of his dye-colored head hairs. For some unknown reason, Gordon made the mistake of leaving the sneakers and sweatshirt behind at his motel, a motel identified through Denise's telephone calls. Prosecutors produced receipts showing Denise had sent Gordon and MacDonald a total of $15,000. After a 2-week trial, Denise Davidson was found guilty of solicitation for murder. She was sentenced to life in prison.
If I had one line description of Denise Davidson, would be she's a cold-hearted bitch.
Robert Gordon and Merrill MacDonald were tried and convicted of first-degree murder. They were both sentenced to death.
One of the more glaring ironies of the case is that Dr. Davidson, through his alimony payments, enabled his wife to hire the hitmen who ultimately killed him.
Denise's boyfriend, Leo Cisneros, who allegedly hired the hitmen, has not been captured. He is believed to be in Jamaica or Venezuela. Investigators say the mountain of forensic evidence against Denise paints an unmistakable portrait of greed and premeditation.
The forensic technicians in this case did an excellent job. They worked on this case tediously. They were able to develop evidence that was not visible to the naked eye, and because of their dedication, they were able to use this evidence in court to gain a conviction.
One thing I learned from this case is if you're going to commit a crime, be careful about today's technology.
Police to report her husband missing. The man was a marathon runner who had gone for a workout but never returned. Forensic evidence revealed that wherever the man went, he ran into some trouble. Southern California lies the small town of Valley Center. About an hour's drive from San Diego, it's a quiet and peaceful community surrounded by hills and farmland. The rustic setting appealed to Jane and Robert Dorotek, who had been married almost 30 years. The couple lived on an 18-acre horse ranch they called Charisma Farms. To Jane, horses were her life.
She obviously was very passionate about her horses. This was one of her great loves.
Bob preferred the outdoors and camping. His passion was physical fitness, and he was a marathon runner. The couple had 3 grown children, 2 sons and a daughter, Claire, who still lived at home. Claire was a marathoner and an expert horsewoman. On a Sunday night in February of 2000, Jane Dorotek called the sheriff to report her husband missing. She said Bob had gone running a few hours earlier, but never returned home.
When she reported him missing, what was going through my mind, even though he's a jogger and ran marathons, I mean, they do have heart attacks and things like that sometimes when they're jogging.
It wasn't unusual for Bob to take long runs, but he had never been out this long. The sheriff and his deputies searched the entire area, concentrating on Bob's usual running routes. The search was ended at 4:30 the next morning with the discovery of a body.
I could see some trauma to the head, as well as a cord wrapped around the victim's neck. My initial thought in looking at the trauma to the body that this was a homicide.
The lack of blood in the area revealed that Bob's injuries had occurred elsewhere.
We found tire impressions in mud, 2 sets of those, and we found shoe impressions that weren't usable, but they were just like deep holes in the leaf litter that was on the ground.
There were drag marks in the mud from the area of the tire impressions to the body. And there was a clue that Bob hadn't been jogging that day.
His shoes were very clean. He didn't have any mud or any splash marks, water marks on his shoes. And the information I had obtained earlier was that he went out for a jog on the previous day, which had been a rainy day as well.
A piece of Dorotik's head hair was found underneath his shirt on his chest, suggesting that he had been dressed after death. And there was another indication someone else had dressed him.
His shoelaces were tied on the outside of his shoes. The knot itself was not tied in the middle of the shoe, as if somebody were to have tied their own shoe.
Whoever dumped the body left mountains of forensic evidence. Investigators knew if the killer was this sloppy here, he'd be just as careless elsewhere. Word of Bob Dorotik's murder spread quickly to friends and family alike. Forensic scientists began their investigation by attempting to identify the vehicle at the crime scene. From the tire impressions in the mud, they measured the distance between the wheels. The vehicle was identified as a pickup truck. Next, they analyzed photographs of the tire impressions.
First, you have to look at the width of the tire track. There's different size tires. Second, you look at the design. Every tire manufacturer has multiple tread designs that they make, designed for different types of road handling.
The pickup truck had 3 different tire models. The impressions were compared to the thousands of tires on the market.
I noticed that the front 2 tires were the same brand tire, which was a Big O brand.
DeMaria identified the side rear tire as a Firestone Radial and the passenger side rear tire as a Cooper brand Discoverer model. At the autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Dorotik died due to blunt force trauma to the head with some type of hammer. There were also signs he had been strangled. Inside his stomach was the undigested dinner Bob consumed on Saturday night, which meant he was killed on Saturday. Jane said Bob left home on Sunday afternoon. Despite his mild-mannered demeanor, a background check revealed Bob Dorotik and his wife separated just a few years earlier, although they had recently reconciled. And Bob had often been at odds with his wife and daughter over the costs of running the horse ranch. Jane and Claire favored investing more money into the ranch for expansion, and there was the possibility of a disgruntled employee. Ranch foreman Lionel Morales had long sided with Claire Dorotik in the debate over whether to expand the ranch.
We have felt it warranted further investigation and an interview with him to see when was the last time he was there, and what did he do when he was there.
Lionel Morales, Claire, and Jane Dorotik all denied any involvement in Bob's murder. Lionel and Claire each had alibis. Jane said she was home all day working with the horses. She cooperated with police by voluntarily allowing them to search her home.
Actually, the homicide detective took me aside before we went in and said, "Now, Carolyn, this is a consent search, so I want you to, all we're looking for is patent, obvious blood. Don't be crawling under things and looking up. Don't be opening drawers. Don't be doing anything. Just be as inobtrusive as possible. It was muddy, so it's a no-shoe house. So to be polite, it's a consent search, and this is the only time ever in my life I've done this at a scene, take off my shoes.
Investigators examined the house and especially the master bedroom and found nothing out of the ordinary. But criminalist Carolyn Gannett decided to take a closer look around, and it was in her stocking feet that Gannett made her discovery.
I just happened to step in one corner of the bedroom, and I could feel wet carpet underneath my feet, through my stocking feet, and my heart just jumped because I knew exactly what that was.
The bedroom floor was wet, as if something had recently been cleaned from the floor, and the carpet had a slight tinge of red.
What really struck me was how easily we could have missed it. If we hadn't taken off our shoes, we would have missed it. We would not have found that scene at all.
I asked the family if there would be any reason that we would find blood in the master bedroom. The family, number of family members began to speak. One was Jane Dorotek's sister, Bonnie Long, who had indicated that one of the dogs had cut his dew claw and had been bleeding.
Investigators decided to conduct more tests to see if it was dog blood in the bedroom or something more. Not long after the murder of 55-year-old Bob Dorotek, investigators had no shortage of forensic evidence or suspects. In the master bedroom of the Dorotek's home, investigators found traces of blood on the floor that had been cleaned up. And when they looked closer, they found even more.
I could see what appeared to be blood spatter all across the comforter of the bed. I could see blood spatter on the headboard. I could see blood spatter on the wall behind the bed.
And there was blood on the brick wall and on the stove in the corner of the bedroom. Some had even dripped down into a utility room below.
I looked at the stains on the wall, stains on the brickwork, and they were all consistent with, in size, about a ½ millimeter in diameter, maybe a little bit less, a little bit more, with medium velocity. It's what I would expect to have seen in a beating.
Merritt's analysis revealed the blood spatter emanated from the top of the bed where Bob may have been sleeping.
The shapes of the stains on the wall and on the nightstand showed me the direction they were traveling in. So I just took strings on the wall, knowing the direction they were traveling in, pulled them back, taped them onto the wall, which gave me an area of convergence.
That area of convergence told forensic scientists the location of Bob's head during the attack. Merritt also found cast-off blood spatter on the ceiling, created when blood is thrown from a moving object.
There was circular stains on the ceiling directly above the bed. That's the first indication of cast-off. The other indication is directional stains, linear stains going away from that site.
DNA testing confirmed it was Bob Dorotek's blood.
The attack didn't occur out on that road. That attack, based on the bloodstains, occurred in that room.
Inside the home, investigators also found a piece of black rope, consistent with the rope found around Bob's neck.
I told Jane we were confident, and there was no doubt, that Bob was assaulted in the master bedroom. And the family gasped.
But investigators found no blood anywhere else in the home, meaning the killer had carried the body downstairs and out of the house. Police couldn't find the murder weapon or any bloody clothing inside the home, and there were no signs of forced entry. An intruder never takes the time to clean a crime scene.
I've been in law enforcement about 28 years. I've not seen or known of one case where an intruder has come into a house, murdered somebody inside a house, and cleaned up afterwards.
Police found a pickup truck in the garage. There were no visible signs of blood, so investigators looked to see if blood had been removed.
We used fluorescein. We sprayed most of the outside of the truck and also the inside, and we did find several areas that fluoresced. There was one area in particular on the bed of the truck that fluoresced. It was fairly large.
Which was an indication blood had been present, then washed off. DNA testing of the hidden blood residue showed the blood was Bob's. The front tires were Type O brand. The passenger side rear tire was a Cooper Discoverer. The driver's side rear tire was a Firestone Radial. All were identical to the impressions left at the crime scene. The white pickup truck was registered to Jane Dorotic. Before leaving the residence, investigators found one last piece of evidence.
In the trash, there were actually several syringes, and one of the syringes was a large barrel syringe. Appeared to be a syringe that might be used on animals.
The syringe contained trace amounts of a potent horse tranquilizer called acepromazine. Toxicology tests did not detect acepromazine in Bob's blood sample, although it could have been present in amounts too small for testing to identify. On the outside of the syringe was a bloody fingerprint. The blood was Bob Dorotic's. The fingerprint was Jane's.
You'll often hear it said that one of the best things you can find at a crime scene is a suspect's fingerprint in the victim's blood. And now, how do you explain that?
3 days after Bob Dorotic was found dead on the side of a road, his wife Jane was arrested and charged with murder.
Your Honor, I'd like to say that I'm innocent. I loved my husband. I love him still.
In May 2001, Jane Dorotic stood trial for the murder of her husband, Robert. Prosecutors believe that Jane injected Bob with the horse tranquilizer while he was sleeping on Saturday night. She then struck him in the head while he was in bed, and then on the floor near the stove. When Jane threw away the syringe, she left her fingerprint in Bob's blood. After dressing the body, she either carried or dragged it downstairs to her pickup truck. When she left the body alongside the road, she did everything but sign her name to the crime. The clean shoes were proof he had not been jogging. The shoelaces showed that someone else had tied them. And the blood underneath his shirt was proof he had been dressed after he was dead. And then there were the tire impressions from her pickup truck. Friends saw Jane late Sunday afternoon at a nearby shopping center, which is where prosecutors think she threw away her bloody clothes and the murder weapon.
Everything that was collected just pointed the finger at Jane Dorotic. There are all these different pieces of a puzzle, and when you put it all together, it just pointed the finger at Jane Dorotic.
The motive appeared to be money.
Jane was very interested in spending a lot of money on the horses, the care of the horses, the boarding of the horses.
He didn't mind Jane's hobby, Jane and Claire's hobby with the horses. However, that they regularly had disagreements about how many family resources this hobby should use.
2 years earlier, when the couple separated, Jane learned that under California law, she would have to pay Bob alimony in the event of a divorce, since she was the primary wage earner.
Bob initially told me that she was extremely angry about the possibility of having to pay him alimony. It made her livid, and that she got very threatening.
We found some letters dated the Friday before he was killed where he was already looking for a job. Maybe he said, this isn't working out, and I think we should go ahead and get a divorce, and she was not about to pay him any alimony.
At the trial, the defense claimed that Claire Dorotek, with the help of Leonel Morales, killed Bob Dorotek. They produced a letter Claire wrote to her father filled with deep hostility over alleged abuse.
She just lived her life in trying to please her father, and it built up a tremendous amount of hatred and resentment over the years about her relationship with her father.
The defense claimed that Leonel Morales was sympathetic to Claire's position.
It was suggested that since he basically worked for Claire Dorotek, and Claire Dorotek didn't like her father, that he would do anything for Claire.
But police were satisfied that each had a solid alibi.
We were confident that Claire was out of town for the weekend, and Jane was the only one that was home, and Jane was the only suspect in our mind.
Claire, do you know why your mom is pointing the finger at you?
Claire Dorotek and Leonel Morales invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and did not testify. Jane offered no explanation for how her fingerprint in her husband's blood was found on a syringe containing a horse tranquilizer. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict.
Cause, find the defendant, Jane Marguerite Dorotek, guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree in violation of...
I was sad, but I was elated that justice was served. For me, she stole, one of my best friends away from me and from all his other friends. And it was the worst kind of theft, really.
Jane Dorotek was sentenced to 25 years in prison. There was no dispute about the critical role forensic evidence played in Jane Dorotek's conviction.
The forensic made it clear he wasn't out for a jog, as she explained. The forensics made it clear his shoes were tied and his clothing was put on after that body was pummeled. And so the forensics told a story, as so often is true when you find a body in a homicide case. The body itself tells a story.
Police say that this car crash, which killed an elderly woman, was murder and arson. The driver, the victim's daughter, insisted it was an accident. 2 fire investigators came to 2 entirely different conclusions. Was it an accident or murder? You decide. Georgia is literally a one-stoplight town, surrounded by peanut farms and cotton fields. On August 18, 1996, a hot, quiet Sunday, a man driving down a remote country road saw a woman standing on a small bridge, waving frantically. The woman was Sheila Bryan.
This guy jumped out of the car, and he said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And I said, my mother's in the car, I think the car's on fire.
The car was down in a ditch, and Sheila's 82-year-old mother was trapped inside. From the bridge, you could see the smoke coming out of the car. The man ran to a nearby house to get help. By the time firefighters arrived, the car was an inferno. When the fire was put out, they found Frida Weeks dead inside the car. She had been unable to get out.
I just remember getting nauseated throwing up. And the next thing I remember is just lots of people.
Sheila told police that she and her mother were on their way to the local cemetery to visit her father's grave. She said she was momentarily distracted and accidentally drove off the road into the ditch just before reaching the bridge.
It was about a 30-foot embankment, which was very steep. And when I got to the bottom, there was a big jolt. I was trying to get the car turned off, and it wouldn't turn off. Somehow finally got it off. And the keys, they dropped out of my hand because I had jerked them, and they dropped out of my hand. I kept telling her, I says, I'll be right back, I'll be right back.
Sheila ran around the car to the passenger side door to try to get her mother out, but the door was locked. Sheila said she ran up the embankment and flagged down a passing vehicle. She said when she looked down, she saw smoke coming out of the car for the first time. When police arrived, they noticed some irregularities.
That car traveled about 60 feet down the grassy shoulder of the road prior to making a right-hand turn and traveling about 30 feet down this embankment where it came to its final resting point perpendicular to the road in the ditch. And then we started looking at, there were no skid marks, there were no signs in the grassy shoulder that there was an abrupt turn of any type.
And the front of the vehicle showed no signs of damage consistent with running down an embankment.
There were no scrape marks under the bumper, under the undercarriage. The plastic cowling under the bumper had no damage to it whatsoever. All signs that were indicative that this car traveled down that embankment very slowly.
Also suspicious, the door to the gas tank was open and the gas cap was missing. No autopsy was performed on Frida Weeks, but the toxicology results were puzzling. Most people who die from smoke inhalation have carbon monoxide levels in their blood of 45 to 85%. But the carbon monoxide level in Frida's blood was 0.
Lab results showed that there was no carbon monoxide in the victim's blood, which could be indicative that she was not alive at the time of the fire.
If Frida Weeks was dead before the fire started, how did she die? The local sheriff's department brought in outside experts to help investigate the car accident and fire which killed Frida Weeks. The engine and exhaust system showed little fire damage, but the passenger compartment was destroyed. It appeared that the fire started on the floor of the driver's side because investigators found burn patterns consistent with the use of an accelerant.
There were also burn patterns that protruded through or over the driver's door threshold, which could be indicative that the door was open at some point during the time of the fire.
The debris inside the car was tested for accelerants, but tests came back negative.
And it's not uncommon in arson cases, especially where fire departments have responded, put a tremendous amount of water on the actual fire scene.
The only personal items found in the car were a wallet and the charred remains of a claw hammer. The possibility that the hammer might have been the murder weapon led investigators to exhume Frida Weeks' body for an autopsy.
That's when I heard that they were suspicioning arson. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I mean, I just could not even believe where they could even come up with that.
And the investigation angered Sheila's husband, too.
Mr. Bryan became more upset and made the statement that, well, you guys need to do whatever you need to do, and you need to do it because there's $100,000 at stake, and the insurance company's not going to pay until you get done with your investigation.
Sheila's husband was referring to the liability coverage of his car insurance, which he believed would pay them $100,000 for Frida's death.
Which kind of corresponded with the amount he told us there in his driveway.
The autopsy found no injuries consistent with the use of a claw hammer. The surprising news was that Frida's lungs and nasal passages did not have any soot, which usually happens when someone is alive and breathes smoke during a fire. The medical examiner found evidence of severe coronary artery disease and listed the probable cause of Frida's death as cardiac standstill.
Dr. Clark said that she was probably alive at the time of the fire and may have taken 1 or 2 gasps after that fire was started and then died.
The medical examiner did not rule the death a homicide. Nevertheless, prosecutors believed that the fire was deliberately set and charged Sheila Bryan with arson and murder. Sheila pled not guilty. At the trial, prosecutors said the motive for the crime was money, that Sheila killed her mother and staged the crime scene to collect a death benefit from her car insurance.
I said, that's ridiculous. I said, this is something that you're required to have by law to be able to drive a vehicle. And 2, there was no way for me to even collect any money from them.
Prosecutors knew that the car insurance wouldn't have paid anything after Frida's death, but believed that Sheila and her husband were unaware of that at the time of the incident. To prove it, prosecutors pointed to the statement Sheila's husband allegedly made to investigators.
It was the state's position that they intended to collect on that insurance money. And the reason the state thought that is first because of what Carlos Bryan told them, that that was their intention. And secondly, because they had hired an attorney to collect the money.
At the trial, Sheila took the stand in her own defense. Her testimony, however, differed in some respects from the statement she gave to police immediately after the accident.
When she got on the stand, she told this story about stopping on the edge of the embankment and teetering.
I was sitting there and I said, I was going to try and get out. I opened the car door and I still had my seatbelt on. And when I did, the car door come back and hit my arm.
And then the car rolled down the ditch bank, which was not anything that she had said at the time of the accident.
Sheila first told investigators that her mother showed no signs of distress after the accident. On the witness stand, she said her mother wasn't responsive.
I told Mama, I says, I'll be back in just a minute. She didn't respond. Well, I thought she had passed out.
When she got on the witness stand, that story had changed remarkably. And I think it didn't ring true to those jurors. But it was testimony about the burn patterns that I think sealed her fate.
The prosecution's arson expert said those burn patterns were consistent with a fire started with an accelerant. The jury found Sheila Bryan guilty of arson and murder. She was sentenced to life in prison.
I could not believe that this had actually happened. I said, why am I here? I don't understand. I even looked around for a rusty screw to cut my wrist. I said, I cannot let my children be exposed to something like this the rest of their life. And then all of a sudden, something come over me. And I said, God, if I'm here to help somebody, then you show me what you want me to do. And I had a peace about me after that.
Sheila's friends and supporters believed in her innocence and raised funds to hire an independent fire investigator to look into the case. And the person they found also happened to be an outspoken critic of arson investigations, Dr. Gerald Hurst.
You had a woman who had a close relationship with her mother and plenty of people who knew about this relationship. They said that the reason that she had torched her mother was because the mother was getting old, wearing a diaper, and she was just too much trouble. You see, it just doesn't fit.
It was real clear to me that this case had divided that community in this area, half believing she was guilty and half believing that she was innocent.
After Sheila Bryan was convicted of murdering her mother in a car fire, Sheila's friends and family hired Dr. Gerald Hurst to conduct an independent investigation.
I read the original investigation reports and all of the police work done in connection with the fire, and then I read the trial testimony, and I found that there was a lot of bunco involved in the prosecution.
Sheila's car was a Ford. Hurst and his colleague, Chris Bloom, quickly discovered that there had been a number of suspicious fires in similar Ford vehicles. The problem was the ignition switch, a box of electrical contacts on the steering column. By turning the key, different contacts in the switch start the car and turns on the electrical system.
And it's a small little component. You don't normally would even think about it, but that little component has been the source of at least alleged 8,000 fires.
Many of these cars caught fire while sitting in garages and parking lots, and some while being driven down the road. In 1996, Ford issued one of the largest car recalls in history. A lead in the ignition switch had electricity flowing through it constantly. A plastic box separated the leads, but in some cases, carbon buildup caused the circuit to arc.
It's creating a circuit where a circuit was not designed. And as a result, there's overheating that's occurring, and that overheating will result in the ignition of the surrounding combustibles, the plastics and such.
Dr. Hurst and Chris Bloom made another interesting discovery. The task force at the Ford Motor Company that confirmed the ignition switch problem was headed by Ralph Newell. Mr. Newell was also a fire expert and was the star witness for the prosecution in Sheila's trial.
I'm not saying that he did anything wrong, but I'm saying he was under heavy influence. He was getting, I think, about $150,000 a year, or at least that year, and certain amounts in other years, working for Ford Motor Company.
The key thing I noted was that not a single person mentioned the ignition switch in the case. And it didn't matter whether they said, I examined the ignition switch and eliminated it as cause. I looked at the ignition switch, there was nothing wrong. There was no mention of it.
This was particularly interesting since Sheila's first statement to police mentioned her inability to remove her car keys after the accident.
Ms. Bryan, after running off the road, tried to get the keys out of the ignition and couldn't get the keys out. That indicates that you have something wrong with the ignition lock or the ignition switch.
Sheila's car was a 1987 Ford Cougar, but the recall only went back to 1988. Bloom and Dr. Hurst suspected that Sheila's car had the same ignition switch.
This is a recalled switch from an 88 Ford Escort. The important thing to note is the model number on the switch. When I pulled the large wiring loom out of the 87 Cougar and examined this switch, you can see the model numbers are the same.
But what caused the burn patterns in the interior, which prosecution experts said was from an accelerant? This steering column, cover, and carpet are from the same model and year car as Sheila Bryan's. Gerald Hurst believes the switch inside the steering column overheated and the plastic cover ignited, melted, and dripped like this one, burning down through the carpet like a liquid accelerant.
Now, if this were in a real automobile, you would also begin dripping the same molten flaming plastic on the seat, which contains polyurethane foam, and that would take off like the proverbial house afire. Anytime a fire consumes the interior of a car, you're going to have masses of flammable plastics that melt and flow. They themselves, the plastics, become, in effect, liquid accelerants.
Hurst also said A gap in the door seal allowed melted plastic from the seats, doors, and dashboard to flow under the door in not one, but 2 spots.
It was not a liquid accelerant that produced it. I'm quite confident it was the plastic, but that was of less importance to me than the fact that the prosecutor and all the king's horses and all the king's men would not be able to produce that pattern with gasoline.
The information should have been presented to the jury. Hey, this is a known problem, that it's a rare problem, but it's a known problem that catches fire.
After 10 months in prison, the Georgia Supreme Court unanimously voted to overturn Sheila's conviction. The court stated the testimony that inferred there was an insurance motive was improper, and any financial motive was tenuous at best.
I immediately got on my knees and prayed and thanked God for that, because that just does not happen. It does not happen in the length of time for me to even get an appeal. Usually people stay in there for years and years before they even get an appeal. So I was very well blessed with that.
Just as Sheila was released from prison, she had another surprise. Prosecutors for the state of Georgia said they would try her again for murder and arson. Due to extensive publicity, the second trial would be held in neighboring Thomas County.
And it was quite naturally a battle of the experts.
But which experts would the jury believe? Converse Bright was the new defense attorney representing Sheila Bryan at her second murder trial.
There was no trauma involved, and the blood test and the autopsy showed that this lady was dead before the fire started, most likely by heart attack. If the jury accepted that, then that ended the case right there.
But the cause of the fire was again the prosecution's focus, claiming Sheila Bryan had set the car fire by pouring and lighting some type of liquid accelerant.
It either came out of the tank or she brought it there. There's no container found. There's no instrument like a siphon or whatever.
This time, Sheila's defense relied on Dr. Hurst's opinion for what caused the deadly fire.
An expert witness in a case performs several functions. Obviously, he testifies and gives expert opinion. He also can help prepare cross-examination by pointing out fallacies and foibles in the other side's position.
Ralph Newell, the prosecution's star witness in the first trial, admitted he had worked for the Ford Motor Company on the task force investigating Ford's past ignition switch problems. But Newell insisted he eliminated the switch in Sheila's car as the cause of the fire. Newell admitted, however, that he did not photograph or document his analysis of the switch in his report. Without the insurance motive, the prosecution argued that Sheila had grown tired of caring for her 82-year-old mother.
They were all one very close-knit family. The testimony was unanimous about that. There was no dissent to that.
After a 4-day trial, the jury deliberated for just under 3 hours before finding Sheila Bryan not guilty.
I just thank you, Lord.
Well, you could cite this case as an example of the system failing in that she did 10 months in jail for something she didn't do. Or you could cite it as an example of the system succeeding because it corrected itself.
2 different trials, 2 different verdicts. The town of Omega will never be the same.
There were heated debates about her guilt or her innocence up until the first trial. And they continued, of course, after she was convicted and went to prison. And they continue to this day.
But Sheila Bryan is a free woman and gives the credit to forensic science.
What made the difference? Having a very credible expert that believed in what he was doing in what he was saying.
This was a case of forensic evidence, whether it be medical or automobile. This was what this case was all about, was forensic evidence.
He allowed his victim to write a last will and testament to her family, then taunted them with chilling phone calls.
Did you receive the letter today? Yes. Okay, so you know now that this is not a hoax call.
A traced phone line couldn't trap the abductor, but scientists would find a clue in the victim's last words. "17-year-old Sherry Smith had her whole life before her. In 2 days, she would have the honor of singing the national anthem at her graduation from the Lexington High School. Then she would sail off on a cruise with her classmates.
She was kind of the cement that held our family together. She was always the happy one.
At 3:38 p.m. on May 31st, 1985, Sherry arrived home from a graduation pool party. She stopped at the mailbox some 700 feet from her house. Her father was watching from his home office as she pulled in.
5 or 10 minutes had passed, and all of a sudden I was aware that Sherry had not come to the house yet. So something just told me that something was wrong, and I ran through the house and into the garage and got in my car and cranked it up and drove to the mailbox.
Bob Smith found the door of his daughter's automobile open, the motor running, and Sherry's purse on the seat.
I saw barefooted footprints going to the mailbox, but none coming back.
And he said, "Honey, I don't know how to tell you this, but Sherry's car is at the end of the driveway running, and she's not in it." And I can remember now, I said, "Oh my God, not my Sherry."
Panic-stricken, the couple called the Lexington County Sheriff's Office.
Near the mailbox on the ground was some mail, which indicated to us that she had gotten out of the car to pick up the mail and was probably abducted at that point.
If you find or spot anything out of the ordinary.
Lexington County Sheriff Jim Metz immediately organized the largest manhunt in South Carolina history.
We really didn't know whether Sherry knew her abductor or not. We certainly had no reason to expect that she had run away or that she left on her own.
That whoever it is that has our daughter Sherry, we want her back. We miss her. We love her. And please send her back home where she belongs.
All her parents could do was wait.
The Smith family was a very influential family in the community, and there was no reason that we could determine why she would be kidnapped other than maybe for ransom purposes. So we anticipated that the individuals responsible would make contact with the family.
The sheriff's suspicions proved right. 2 days after Sherry had been abducted, the Smiths received a phone call. A man with a strangely distorted voice demanded to speak to Mrs. Smith. To prove the call was not a hoax, he described the black and yellow bathing suit Sherry was wearing beneath her shorts and shirt.
He said he would release her. He said that she was fine, they were watching TV, she was eating a little bit, and but he was giving her lots of water, and she was doing great.
He made no ransom demand, but he told the Smiths that they would be receiving a letter in the morning.
My reaction was an individual who's got some sophistication in the crime he's committing. This is not the first time that he has engaged in a sex crime of some sort. Probably has been thinking about committing a crime like this for quite some time.
Agent Walker agreed that the best hope of finding Sherry could come from the letter her abductor promised was coming.
We woke up the postmaster in Lexington on the weekend, went over to the post office and started looking through the mail.
And everybody put on plastic gloves and we all sorted through the mail till we found the letter addressed to the Smiths.
Inside was a letter in Sherry's handwriting. At the top of the first page was the heading, Last Will and Testament. Sherry Smith's abductor had allowed the teenager to write a 2-page letter to her family in which she told them how much she loved them.
I had a very helpless feeling come over me, but I was not without hope. I held out my hope to the end, but I was totally helpless. The word last will and testament just knocked me back, and I was totally helpless. I did not know what to do or what to say. And then the tough part was I had to show the letter to my wife.
Please don't ever let this ruin your lives, Sherry's letter read. Just keep on living one day at a time for Jesus. Some good will come out of this. My thoughts will always be with and in you. In parentheses were the words, casket closed. Sheriff Metz immediately sent the letter to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Crime Lab, hoping forensic document examiner Mickey Dawson could find some clues.
I was looking for handprinting or handwriting. I was looking to see if I could find any trace evidence to send to hairs and fibers.
After the letter arrived, the abductor called the Smith family again.
Have you received the mail today?
Yes, I have.
Do you believe me now?
Well, I'm not really sure I believe you because I haven't had any word from Sherry. And I need to know that Sherry is well.
You'll know in 2 or 3 days.
Why 2 or 3 days?
Call the search office.
Later that same evening, he called once more, saying that Sherry was alive and implied he would release her soon.
I want to tell you one other thing. Sherry is now part of me. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, our souls are one now.
The call was traced to a public payphone at a drugstore in downtown Lexington. But in 1985, trap and trace required 15 minutes for authorities to trace the call and reach its location. The abductor remained on the phone for a very short time. 5 days after Sherry's abduction, the kidnapper called again and spoke to both Sherry's mother and her 21-year-old sister, Dawn.
Okay, 4:58 a.m. No, I'm sorry, hold on a minute. 3:10 a.m. Saturday, the 1st of June. She handwrote what you received. 4:58 a.m. Saturday, the 1st of June.
Okay, Saturday, the 1st of June, 4:58 a.m.
Became one soul.
Became one soul. What does that mean?
No questions now. Please, to Sheriff Metz. Search no more. Blessings are near.
Do not kill my daughter, please. I mean, please.
Love and miss y'all. Get good rest tonight. Goodbye.
Wait a minute. He's gone, Mom.
The next day, he made another call.
Hello?
Listen carefully. Take Highway 378 west to Traffic Circle. Take Prosperity exit. Go 1.5 miles. Turn right at sign. Moose Lodge number 103. Go 1/4 mile. Turn left at white frame building. Go to backyard. 6 feet beyond, we're waiting. God chose us.
And I begged the police officers, I said, let me go with you. Let me go. I want to go with you to find Sherry.
But investigators insisted on going alone. Sherry's body was found in the backyard. On the body were the yellow top and white shorts she'd last been seen in. The autopsy revealed Sherry had been dead for several days. Investigators believe that Sherry's abductor inadvertently revealed when he killed her when he corrected himself about the time she wrote the letter. They believe Sherry died at 4:58 on the morning of June 1st, 2 hours after she wrote the letter. If that were the case, Sherry remained alive for only 12 hours after her abduction.
One line I'll never forget when she says, "casket closed." Can you imagine what was going through her mind knowing what she was going to face? She knew at that point that her body would be in a condition that the casket had to be closed.
Agent Walker believes the killer tried to buy time while the body was outside, diminishing the chances to recover crucial forensic evidence. The medical examiner found residue of duct tape on her face, suggesting that the cause of death was suffocation.
Her hair was substantially shorter. He had to cut the duct tape out of her hair to keep from leaving it behind. And that told me that he had some experience, at least, or some level of criminal sophistication.
Based on knowledge gained from past offenders of similar crimes, the FBI had this hypothesis.
The profile that we developed of him described a white male, prior married, unsuccessfully married, probably not currently married, mid to late 20s to maybe even as old as early 30s, who had a history of sex crimes.
The Signal Analysis Unit of the FBI Engineering Section told investigators that the voice distortion of the abductor's voice was accomplished by something called a variable speed control device.
We believed either through employment or through his technical education had some sort of background or experience in electronics.
Investigators believe the killer had everything planned out and was reading from a script clearly evident when he corrected himself about the time of Sherry's letter.
4:58 a.m. No, I'm sorry, hold on.
As a final assault to the family, the killer called them on the night of Sherry's funeral. It was a collect call.
He wanted to tell us just how he had murdered Sherry, and he said, well, can you take it? Who could take it? But we didn't have a choice. We had to try to keep him on the line to find out where he was.
A few weeks later, the killer called again. This time, he no longer wanted to talk about Sherry.
That's her little string of cool.
After the funeral of 17-year-old Sherry Smith, her killer continued to taunt the family by phone, but he no longer had any interest in Sherry.
Have you heard about Deborah May Hambrick?
No.
The 10-year-old? H-E-L-M-I-C-K?
Richland County?
Yeah?
Uh-huh.
Okay, listen carefully.
2 weeks after Sherry Smith was kidnapped, Deborah May Helmick was abducted in front of her parents' trailer in Richland County, 24 miles from the Smiths' home. Her father was inside, just 20 feet away. A neighbor saw someone pull up in a car, get out, and grab Deborah before speeding off. Like Sherry, Deborah was a pretty blue-eyed blonde. Unlike Sherry, Deborah was only a child.
Turn right. Last dirt road before you come to stop sign at 2 Notch Road. Go through chain and no trespassing sign. Go 50 yards and to the left. Go 10 yards. Deborah May is waiting. God forgive us all.
I felt like we were dealing with the same individual.
Investigators now knew they were hunting a serial killer. Based on vast criminal research, authorities believed that the killer would be displaying more compulsive behavior, losing weight, drinking heavily, not shaving regularly, and would be eager to talk about the murder. At the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, scientists were still going over their only piece of hard evidence, Sherry's last will and testament. It had been written on lined paper from a legal pad. Forensic document examiner Mickey Dawson believed latent images or indentations from a previous page of the pad might be revealed with the use of an electrostatic detection apparatus.
When I received the letter, took it into the laboratory and opened it up on sterile paper, and with gloves, took the pages apart, looked at each page, did the initial examination intake, and then each sheet would individually go into a humidified box.
Increasing the humidity of the paper would yield a better result from the conductivity of electrical charges. The document was then placed on top of a brass plate and the magnetic field activated. The paper was then brushed with a substance similar to fingerprint powder.
Through the combination of all of this, latent images form.
Dawson's first try yielded what appeared to be a grocery list.
There were some bills to pay, and there was a list of names and telephone numbers left for someone to call in case of an emergency.
Dawson was able to make out what appeared to be a partial telephone number. The first set of numbers, 205, was the area code for Alabama. The next three, 837, was the exchange for Huntsville. But they only had 3 of the last 4 numbers to finish the sequence.
They just plugged the 9 digits in for the 7th and found a telephone number that was a good number.
I finally called this guy in Alabama and said, do you have any relatives in South Carolina? He said, yes, it's my mother and father.
The man's father was 50-year-old Ellis Shepard, who lived just 15 miles away from Sherry Smith's home. Telephone records indicated that some of the calls to the Smith family after Sherry's abduction were made from Shepard's home. Not surprisingly, police wanted to hear what Mr. Shepard had to say. 50-year-old Ellis Shepard was an electrician, and telephone records showed that some of the calls to the Smiths' home after her abduction were made from his phone.
I wasn't worried, but, you know, it was a little bit of a shock that they wanted to talk to me.
Shepard had no idea why his son's telephone number was found on Sherry Smith's last will and testament. Shepard said he and his wife were on vacation at the time of Sherry Smith's abduction, an alibi which checked out.
At Beach Festival Road.
Then police played a recording of the killer's voice.
I said, dirty son of a bitch, because I knew it was him. And they said, what? And I said, that's Larry Gene Bell. And then, of course, they got very excited because, you know, they knew then that they had their person.
Larry Gene Bell. He worked for Ellis doing electrical wiring. Bell was house-sitting for the Shepards during the 6 weeks they had been away on vacation.
I'd left Bell a lot of phone numbers that he may need to call in my absence while we were on our trip.
Those pages were turned over to investigators. A transparency of the Shepards' original note was superimposed over Sherry's last will and testament. The Shepards' note matched the indentations on Sherry's letter, proving that Sherry used the piece of paper directly underneath. The Shepards also said that when Bell picked them up at the airport, all he wanted to talk about was the kidnapping and murder of the Smith girl. Bell had lost weight, was unshaven, and seemed highly agitated. This is the police video taken inside the Shepards' home. Investigators found 6 blonde hairs in the bathroom that were microscopically similar to Sherry's hair. The commemorative duck stamp used to mail her last will and testament matched a sheet of stamps in Ellis Shepard's desk drawer.
My silent crayons, food for thought.
Bell was arrested the following morning.
He just seemed to be shocked that law enforcement now had centered in on him.
As the FBI had predicted, Bell had been involved in various sexual incidents since childhood.
He had been in trouble for making obscene telephone calls and at one point even attempting to kidnap a young co-ed from the University of South Carolina.
When questioned, Bell denied any involvement in the murders of Sherry Smith and Deborah Helmick.
The only thing he wanted to say over and over was that this Larry Gene Bell didn't do it. It's the bad Larry Gene Bell.
Larry Gene Bell stood trial for the murder of Sherry Smith in January 1986.
In my closing argument, I told the jury, Sherry Smith had the fortitude and the courage to write out her last will and testament. And I put the pen that we took from the Shepherd's house in front of the jury. I said, now each one of you, don't you have the courage to sign your name on a death penalty verdict? Ooh, it was electrifying.
The jury needed only 47 minutes to return the verdict of guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder. Larry Gene Bell was sentenced to death by electrocution.
That was the only punishment for him. And probably, this is horrible to say, too good of a punishment for him.
He was tried separately for the kidnapping and murder of Deborah Helmick. That jury returned the same verdict. 10 years after his trial, Larry Gene Bell became the last man to die in South Carolina's electric chair.
Without that letter, and without the ability to bring up things on that page that you couldn't see with the naked eye, it would have been even longer before we would have gotten Larry Gene Bell.
That piece of paper, that indented writing, is what made the case and what sealed his fate. He ultimately signed his death warrant.
Bob Smith remains a chaplain for the Sheriff's Department. His wife Hilda recently authored a book, The Rose of Sherry, to honor their daughter's memory. Both are convinced, as Sherry predicted in her last will and testament, some good has come out of their monumental loss.
That letter has been more closure to me than any kind of closure that the courts can do for me. Just the fact that she knew where she was going and she had that kind of faith.
A man died in his home after a long history of heart disease. It was assumed that this was the cause of his death. A few weeks after the funeral, rumors surfaced that the death was no accident. When the body was exhumed, scientists needed to know whether the dead could tell tales. On a January night in 1990, a woman called for an ambulance saying her boyfriend was unconscious and barely breathing. Emergency personnel were at the home in Westport, Massachusetts within minutes.
We arrived on the scene, went into the house, and we found a male sitting in a chair, and he was just kind of slumped forward, unresponsive.
The man's girlfriend said he had a long history of heart trouble.
As soon as I took his robe apart, I saw that he had a scar from a past cardiac surgery, which indicated that he had had a bypass surgery at some point in time. And we began CPR.
But the CPR brought no response. 61-year-old Richard Alfredo was pronounced dead an hour later at a nearby hospital. Because of his heart disease, the local medical examiner decided not to perform an autopsy.
Mr. Alfredo had a long history of severe heart disease, which necessitated a surgical correction of his blocked coronary arteries in the heart, a coronary bypass procedure. So at the time of his death, he had every reason to die from his heart disease.
Richard Alfredo was buried 4 days after his death. All of his assets, worth about $25,000, went to his estranged wife and children. Alfredo's girlfriend, 39-year-old Christina Martin, continued to live in the house the couple shared along with her 2 children from a previous marriage. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until Westport police officer Mike Roussel started hearing rumors.
We heard rumors that Mr. Alfredo's death was due to poisoning, and this was just facts that we couldn't prove at that time, was just information, and as a police department we had the obligation to start looking into this.
The rumors emanated from some students at a nearby high school. Richard Alfredo's girlfriend, Christina Martin, had a 14-year-old daughter, Tisha, who attended Westport High School. Tisha allegedly told school friends that Alfredo had made sexual advances towards her on numerous occasions. And she admitted that she and her mother were angry about it.
The teenagers were telling us Miss Martin was trying to locate anything that would take the life of Mr. Alfredo.
Investigators now wondered whether they made a mistake burying the body without an autopsy. Four weeks after Richard Alfredo's death, rumors circulated that his death was no accident. The daughter of Alfredo's girlfriend, Tisha, allegedly told friends that Alfredo had made sexual advances towards her. And she also said that her mother put the drug LSD in Alfredo's gelatin dessert in an effort to kill him.
They made the Jell-O. They made it 2 separate dishes. They ate Jell-O, but his dish was kept to the side. At that time, they fed him the Jell-O, and then they went out of the house, and they came back, and he was basically dead at that time. They called rescue, and he was transported to St. Luke's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead.
LSD is a powerful hallucinogen known on the street as acid. A dose or hit usually comes in tablets or in liquid soaked into paper. A single drop can cause hallucinations for 6 to 10 hours.
We've been told by people that have taken LSD, you're seeing all kinds of different things, animals running across the room at you, things crawling up the wall, things crawling on you. So, you know, it would have put him in a position where he had no idea what was going on.
And LSD can also cause a rapid increase in heart rate. A local drug dealer admitted selling 30 doses of LSD to a small group, which included Alfredo's girlfriend, Christina, and her daughter, Tisha.
They identified Miss Martin as sitting in the vehicle, and they brought the drugs to her, and they left the area at that time.
During police questioning, Christina denied buying LSD or giving Richard Alfredo any harmful substances.
Miss Martin was trying to locate anything that would take the life of Mr. Alfredo, no matter whether it was some type of a medication or pills, or she even tried to get some of the teenagers to, they would take him out with a weapon, being she was going to provide the gun for them. which was Mr. Alfredo's guns.
To see if LSD had caused Alfredo's death, the medical examiner exhumed his body 6 weeks after the funeral. In a living person, LSD leaves the body within 36 hours of use. But in a dead person, the drug can stay indefinitely, although the embalming process can complicate matters.
The process of embalming is such that all the blood in the body is removed and replaced with embalming fluid, a preservative, so that any attempt at trying to find poisons is hampered because there is no blood left in the body.
But they found some other tissue samples to test.
There was some urine, there was some intestinal contents, there were some stomach contents.
The samples were sent to 2 different labs for testing, the state crime lab and another private laboratory. Dr. Louis Amoruso performed the testing at the private lab and used what is called a radioimmunoassay test, or RIA. It's similar to the test used at sporting events to screen athletes for the presence of performance-enhancing drugs. Dr. Amoruso took a sample of LSD, then mixed it with a radioactive compound, then added samples from Alfredo's body. If LSD were present in Alfredo's body, he would have formed antibodies to fight it. Those antibodies will bind to the radioactive LSD sample, producing a positive result. Both the private lab and the police lab found 2 drugs present in Alfredo's system. One was diphenhydramine, a common over-the-counter cold medication. The other was LSD.
The more important compound, as far as we were concerned, was LSD, because there are no prescriptions for LSD, and that would indicate something that would not be found except under illicit conditions.
LSD causes the heart to beat more vigorously. The stresses placed on the very diseased heart caused a fatal heart attack.
The case stood for 7 long years. That is, until it came up for a routine appeal, where Christina's lawyer found something in the case file he wasn't supposed to see. Christina Martin had served 7 years in prison for the murder of her boyfriend, Richard Alfredo, before her case came up for a routine appeal. Christina's new lawyer was a public defender, Kevin Mahoney. His first task was to go to the courthouse to pick up the case file.
While I was standing at the counter waiting for the evidence to be brought to me by the clerk, I struck up a conversation with the gentleman next to me, who wound up being an assistant DA. He turns to me and he says, "Counsel, you're representing Miss Martin?" I said, "Yes."
The assistant DA told Mahoney to look very closely at Richard Alfredo's official cause of death.
Well, I was stunned that a prosecutor would make such an admission to me. I definitely took it as a red flag, and this is something I should follow through with.
This was the first murder case Mahoney ever handled, and he read every page of transcript of Christina's first trial, paying particular attention to anything related to how Richard Alfredo had died.
The transcripts were so fascinating, I couldn't put it down. It was like a great novel. At first blush, it seemed that the evidence was overwhelming, because these toxicologists, these chemists are getting in there and they're testifying that there's massive amounts of LSD. Jesus, it didn't sound good.
But then, he came across this document, Richard Alfredo's death certificate, stating the cause of death as acute LSD intoxication. Mahoney made a telephone call to Dr. David Benjamin, a highly respected clinical pharmacologist.
There had never been a case reported where a person had died from the direct effects of LSD. So right away, that allegation was inconsistent with a whole body of scientific information dating back to the mid-60s. That's a 30-year period of time.
And Dr. Benjamin noticed another potential discrepancy. The RIA test was designed to work only on fresh urine samples, which the medical examiner didn't have after the body was autopsied. The labs tested tissue samples and degraded blood, all of which had been embalmed.
I called the manufacturer and I asked, do you have any experience with using this test in samples other than fresh urine, in particular forensic samples obtained from exhumed bodies or from dead people? And they said, absolutely not.
And even if the urine tests positive for LSD, the RIA test is only for screening. Any positive results must then be retested to confirm the results. On the RIA test kit outer box, the manufacturer makes this clear. It states that all RIA results are preliminary and that a specific alternative must be used to get a confirmed analytical result. Even the scientist who conducted the original RIA test for the prosecution agreed with that assessment.
In order to say with 100% certainty that it was LSD that was present in the body, one would have to go to a confirmatory test. The gold standard, or the test that is considered to be the most dependable, is the one that's called gas chromatography mass spectrometry.
For whatever reason, Christina Martin's first lawyer never questioned the test results.
The defense attorney at the trial was so incompetent and his performance was so bad that the judge called him up to sidebar and asked him, "You're not doing very much examination of these witnesses. Is that intentional? Is that deliberate?"
And the attorney tried to reassure the judge and tell him, oh, don't worry, it'll all come out in my defense case, but it never did.
If the scientific tests were only preliminary, why wasn't a confirmatory test ever performed? Kevin Mahoney found the answer to that question in the evidence file, information prosecutors never presented at the first trial. Information prosecutors thought would remain a secret. When Kevin Mahoney examined the case file from Christina Martin's first trial, he found an important piece of evidence. It was evidence that prosecutors never presented at the first trial. Prosecutors had commissioned a confirmatory test on Alfredo's tissue samples using a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. It's a test that can identify every substance in the sample.
That test detected no LSD in any of the samples. Even though they tested and retested and retested, they were desperate to confirm what they had learned from the radioimmunoassay test, but they weren't able to do that.
Mahoney discovered that this exculpatory forensic evidence was not given to Christina Martin's defense attorney before the trial. This violated a legal provision known as the Brady Doctrine.
The Brady Doctrine says that the prosecution has a duty to turn over all exculpatory evidence to the defense without even being asked for it.
In this case, the prosecutor played hide the ball with the exculpatory evidence. The gas chromatography mass spectrometry evidence should have been disclosed to the defense attorney. It never was.
This may explain why an assistant DA told Mahoney to look carefully at the official cause of Richard Alfredo's death. And this new forensic evidence was put before an appeals court judge who was unusually qualified for this particular case.
99 out of 100 judges. Eyes would have just glazed over when they started hearing GC mass spec and all this other stuff. The judge in this case, Judge Gordon Dorfer, was a chemistry major in college. How lucky were we?
In his decision, Judge Dorfer cited defects in the scientific evidence and the prosecution's failure to disclose critical exculpatory evidence as grounds for a new trial. But prosecutors decided not to retry the case. Christina Martin agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a sentence of time served. In other words, Christina Martin was a free woman. Moments after leaving the courtroom, Christina Martin told the press that despite the plea bargain, she had nothing to do with her boyfriend's death.
I pleaded guilty because of the plea bargain and the chance that I might go back to jail. I didn't want that.
I would have liked to have had this woman found not guilty, but this is not the first person in Massachusetts to say they did something in order to get out of being prosecuted. When your feet are being held to the fire, you're going to do things you really don't want to do.
But if Christina Martin was innocent, why did she flee to Canada shortly after Alfredo's death?
She may have had a guilty conscience about some of the things that she was thinking about doing and maybe some of the things that she had done. Plus, there was also the possibility, with her daughter involved, that her daughter might have done some things to this gentleman without her knowledge.
But while science rules out LSD, it reveals another possibility. When Alfredo's body was exhumed, the medical examiner found groundwater in the casket. The water mixed with the embalming fluid may have contaminated the tissue samples.
Basically, LSD has a chemical structure, and that chemical structure is not unique to LSD. There are many substances in the body and in nature in general that possess similar chemical structures. Two of them that we would find in the body would be the amino acid tryptophan and the neurotransmitter serotonin. There are also ergot derivatives that are in the grass and the ground and in fungi and fungal material that could have been washed into the coffin when all of the water seeped into the coffin.
And the preliminary drug test was supposed to be used on fresh urine samples, not tissue samples. Dr. Benjamin also believes it may have been the cold medicine, diphenhydramine, that Alfredo was taking for his cold that caused his death, since it can increase one's heart rate.
I will tell you what reasonable doubt arose for me, and that was, first of all, nobody dies from LSD. They commit suicide, but they don't have direct toxic effects that lead to death.
The original prosecutor in this case refused all requests for an interview. Officially, prosecutors still maintain that Christina Martin killed Richard Alfredo. Defense experts say LSD has never killed anyone. Today, Richard Alfredo's tombstone is not engraved with the date of his death. Perhaps a metaphor for the uncertainty that still exists in this case.
Bad science and bad ethics resulted in Miss Martin being sent to a prison cell. It was good ethics and good science that got her out of the prison cell. So bad science put her in, and good science got her out.
A 12-year-old girl is murdered in her own home, and the case stalls when investigators find little forensic evidence at the crime scene. But scientists also know that criminals unknowingly take evidence with them as they leave a crime scene. And in this case, the killer left with the genetic fingerprint of his victim. In between two of Minnesota's 10,000 lakes is the small town of Waseca, a quiet community with virtually no violent crime. Not far from the shores of Loon Lake was the home of Connie Larson and her 3 daughters.
They're all like 5 and 4 years apart, but they are very close. They were never apart, and they just adored each other. Callie was definitely the baby of the family, and she was Daddy's little girl.
12-year-old Callie Jo was in the 7th grade and loved gymnastics.
She was good, I think, because she just loved it and she put a lot of energy into it. It was a wonderful place for her to be, and with her energy and spirit, she just really did well in gymnastics.
After school on April 20th, 1999, Callie Jo got off her school bus and walked down this path towards home, just as she always did. Callie Jo was the first one home that day. Her mother and sister were expected later.
The rule in the family was everyone needed to be home and no visitors at 5 o'clock, because that's when I arrived home, and then we had our family time.
16-year-old Jamie was the next family member to arrive home. When she opened the door, she saw evidence of a burglary and something far worse. Jamie immediately called her mother at work and then police.
I realized that there was something wrong and she wasn't telling me.
Coming around the corner and looking up the stairs was a difficult sight for everybody. I mean, there were 30-year investigators that were having a difficult time with that. But it's just looking at who would do something like this.
Upstairs, Callie Jo was dead.
The fatal stab wound was in the left chest area, cut the ascending aorta, and she bled to death internally.
It's still hard for me to think that she's gone. I mean, that means dead. That it just can't be.
I've got 2 kids of my own. If this occurred to one of my children, I don't know what I would do, and I can't even imagine it.
Callie Jo's school books were near the front door, an indication she may have surprised the intruder. The point of entry was the basement door. Some cash, silver certificates, and the girl's CD collection of music were missing. Forensic scientists found blood on the stairs, which was collected for analysis. Despite the clutter, investigators also looked for fingerprints.
You kind of tend to focus on the areas where you're pretty sure that the perpetrator was. And then you focus on areas where drawers were tossed and stuff has been, taken out and moved around. There weren't too many surfaces left in that house that did not have some kind of fingerprint powder residue.
Investigators vacuumed the carpeted floors for possible trace evidence. They were convinced that the killer had left behind enough forensic evidence to catch him.
We had a lot of fingerprints. There were hundreds of hairs in those vacuumings. I initially thought that we were in good shape.
A forensic case is like a puzzle, and you are trying to find different pieces of the puzzle that fit to give you the picture as to what happened in the case.
Callie Jo Larson's death set a sad precedent for Waseca, Minnesota. The small town had never had a homicide in its history.
It destroys the safety factor of everybody in this town. Everybody.
Well, I think a lot more people started locking their doors. Which sounds a little flippant, but that's the reaction.
Forensic scientists thought the blood on the steps near Callie Jo's body may have been the killer's, but forensic tests revealed it was Callie Jo's. Next, investigators hoped the killer left his fingerprints in the home, but this was another dead end.
When all the dust had settled, so to speak, all of the latent prints that we had taken out of the house were identified to family members and friends. There were no unknowns left.
One of the fingerprints found on the bathroom sink was initially difficult to identify, but later it was identified as Callie Jo Larson's fingerprint. Over time, Peterson would come to easily recognize Callie Joe's unique pattern.
She had a loop pattern, but it had another loop that was over the first loop and kind of came to a point on the other end. That's unique. You don't see that very often.
The only other physical evidence from the crime scene were 2 foreign hairs, one found on Callie Joe's body, the other on the carpet.
But until you know whose hairs to compare them to, you've got nothing.
And the hairs didn't have any root material, so they couldn't be sent for nuclear DNA testing. A neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar man near the Larson home around the time of the murder. This is the composite sketch of the man. Another neighbor saw a black pickup truck in the area. Police searched their records for individuals matching this general description who also had a past history of burglary and sex offenses. They found 12 potential suspects.
Well, we called them the Dirty Dozen. And because we had 12 suspects that we could not exclude from the investigation, either, by alibi or whatever reason.
One of the so-called Dirty Dozen was a convicted sex offender, Donald Blum. The significant fact about Blum was that he was also a suspect in the kidnapping and murder of 19-year-old Katie Poyer, a convenience store cashier in Moose Lake, Minnesota, just a few hours' drive away. These are security camera pictures of that abduction. Unfortunately, they weren't clear enough to identify the abductor. Police learned that Blum made several trips to Waseca around the time of Callie Joe's murder. He also drove a black pickup truck like the one seen near Larson's home.
And I was being bombarded with so many truths that I didn't want to know. So as I heard more about Donald Blum, I suppose the more fascinated we became with the possibility that it could be.
Blum denied any involvement in Callie Joe's death and said he had an alibi for the day of the murder. As winter approached in Waseca, hope faded.
November, December was a very bleak time. Everybody was very depressed.
Despite more than 30,000 pages of reports and boxes of physical evidence, investigators weren't any closer to solving the crime than the day it occurred.
And at that point, we had absolutely nothing, and I was really becoming concerned whether this case was ever going to be solved.
And soon, police in Waseca were faced with another crime problem. There were a rash of home burglaries in Waseca not far from the Larson home. And the perpetrator left behind some evidence, a shoe impression from an athletic shoe which had a distinctive zigzag pattern.
A lot of the burglaries had been happening on my shifts, and it was becoming very personal.
On a routine patrol near the burglaries, Officer Markison spotted a man walking along the sidewalk. As Markison drove past, the man abruptly changed direction.
This didn't make a whole lot of sense. It just kind of rolls the hair up on the back of my neck.
So Markison stopped the man to ask a few questions. When he did, he noticed something familiar.
And Markison was able to look down and saw the shoe print in the snow, and that looked like the shoe print that they'd been seeing from some of those burglaries.
And while patting him down, found a large screwdriver and a flashlight in his pocket, burglary tools.
There's no good reason for this guy to be walking in this neighborhood at 8 o'clock at night with a screwdriver and a flashlight in his pocket.
The man was identified as Lorenzo Sanchez, an illegal immigrant from Mexico. In his home, police found stolen property from several burglaries, and police couldn't help but wonder whether Lorenzo Sanchez was also the man who had killed Callie Joe Larson. Not surprisingly, with the arrest of Lorenzo Sanchez, the Waseca burglaries stopped. In Sanchez's home, police found items stolen from the burglaries. They also found many compact discs, but not the ones stolen from Callie Jo Larson's home. In the bottom of Sanchez's closet, police found 2 CD cases. On a hunch, they were photographed and shown to Connie Larson.
The officer came over with a picture of the CD cases and said they saw these, and I just want you to look at them and just tell me if you recognize them. And I took the picture and I said, yes, those are Callie's.
Sanchez denied the cases were stolen and said they were his.
Esos fueron comprados en la tienda.
I bought those in the store.
It had been almost a year since Callie Jo's murder, and investigators hope there may be some forensic evidence on the CD cases. The first problem was that the outside cover was vinyl.
Just getting the latent fingerprints off them is slim to none to begin with. If you do get one, getting one that's a good usable, identifiable latent fingerprint is even slimmer.
Nevertheless, the cases were sent to Dave Peterson for analysis.
And I got to the second to the last page of the second CD case. I opened it up and there was a blonde hair laying in between the sleeves. Now, I got a little excited about that. In fact, my heart started racing just a hair. Pardon the pun.
That hair was sent for DNA testing. Next, Peterson wanted to see if there were any fingerprints on the plastic sleeves which hold the individual CDs. For that, he used a technique called super glue fuming.
I suspended these 2 CD cases from a rod and then fanned out these plastic sleeves that were on the inside. And what happens, the super glue fumes, as they are emitted from the heat, will adhere to the moisture left behind in a latent print and turn the ridge detail white.
Peterson found only 1 print on the very last sleeve of the second CD case. The print had a distinctive overlapping loop, one Peterson immediately recognized. The analysis confirmed that it was Callie Jo's right ring fingerprint.
And at that point, I called Bob Berg and said, I think I got something for you.
I said, you got to be shitting me. I knew that he was our guy at that point. I knew it was him.
We weren't finding the suspect's fingerprint on something to put him at the scene. We kind of did this in reverse. We found him in possession with something that came from the scene.
The blonde hair found in the CD case was further confirmation. DNA test showed it belonged to Callie Jo. Despite the evidence, Sanchez denied he was involved in the murder. All the evidence proved was that Sanchez was in possession of a piece of stolen property.
Did you kill Callie Jo Larson?
But police had one last piece of evidence: the 2 foreign hairs recovered from the Larson crime scene. Those hairs, along with a hair sample from Lorenzo Sanchez, were sent to the forensic lab for the newest DNA test available.
Mitochondrial DNA is a specialized DNA test. If you cannot obtain results using nuclear DNA analysis, you'll fall back on mitochondrial DNA testing.
Mitochondria live outside the cell nucleus. For the test, each hair sample is placed into a vial where it changes form into a liquid. The impurities are extracted, leaving only purified DNA. Next, millions of copies are made of just the mitochondria portion and then sequenced. When completed, Dr. Holland could read the genetic code of the hairs from the crime scene.
And so this particular piece of the puzzle suggested that those hairs were in fact from Mr. Sanchez.
The question was, which Mr. Sanchez? Mitochondrial DNA is passed from a mother to her children, all of whom will therefore have the same mitochondrial DNA profile. In other words, the suspect, Lorenzo Sanchez, would have the same mitochondrial DNA as his 6 brothers and sisters. To complicate matters, Lorenzo's younger brother, Miguel, also had a police record and was in Waseca at the time of the murder. The investigation into Callie Joe's murder wasn't over yet.
Soy inocente de eso.
I am innocent of that cause. I did not kill her. It is an injustice what they're doing with me.
Lorenzo Sanchez continued to maintain his innocence in the murder of Callie Joe Larson, even though a CD case with Callie Joe's fingerprint was discovered in Sanchez's home. And 2 hairs found at the crime scene had the same mitochondrial DNA profile as Lorenzo Sanchez.
Mitochondrial DNA is not positive identification, as nuclear DNA is.
Since mitochondrial DNA is passed from a mother to her children, all of the Sanchez siblings would have the same mitochondrial DNA profile. 2 of Lorenzo Sanchez's brothers had spent time in Waseca, a younger brother, Miguel, and an older half-brother, Pedro. Pedro said he had an alibi, that he was in Mexico on the day of Callie Joe's murder, which checked out. Miguel Sanchez was in Waseca that day, but his timesheet showed that he was at work at the time of Callie Joe's murder. Lorenzo was the only Sanchez brother with no alibi. His work record showed that he was not at work when the murder occurred. With that, Lorenzo Sanchez was charged with first-degree murder. He maintained his innocence until his sister-in-law visited him in prison, and the 2 had a conversation that was taped by prison officials.
He specifically says in that conversation, you know, the only thing that they have to link me is the hair. You understand? The hair is the only thing they've got.
And Sanchez asks his sister-in-law to place the blame for Callie Joe's murder on his half-brother Pedro. She refused.
Well, there was apparently some sibling rivalry there, and his brother Pedro had a record which included some violent offenses.
When Lorenzo Sanchez was confronted with the tape of this conversation, he had few choices. He eventually pled guilty to first-degree murder and was convicted. Forensic evidence. The microscopic hair Sanchez left behind and Callie Joe's hair and fingerprint on the CD case told the story. At his sentencing, Connie Larson finally had her chance to speak directly to her daughter's killer.
In his confession and then in his statement after, asked us to forgive him.
Can you?
Well, you know, when you haven't been in this place, it's hard to know what you would do. But being in this place, it hasn't been hard for me. Honestly, on that day, I put it down.
2 years after the crime, Lorenzo Sanchez was sentenced to life in prison.
I know where to start.
Today, Connie Larson works as a social worker with families who've lived through traumatic events. She's also become an advocate for better databases to track criminals like Lorenzo Sanchez, who often slip through the cracks. Callie Joe is never far from her thoughts.
We talk about her constantly. We tell stories about her. We read her notes. She is just a part of what we're doing now today.
Without the forensics, we had nothing. This case was to live or die by the forensic evidence?
Well, it was absolutely critical. We would have not had a case without that forensic evidence. Lorenzo Sanchez would never have been convicted of the murder of Callie Larson without it.
She was home alone, making the dress she planned to wear on her Friday night date. But she had an uninvited visitor. It took 24 years before forensic science could identify the individual who was there that fateful night. It was 1962. President John F. Kennedy was leading the country at the height of the Cold War. The world anxiously watched as the United States confronted the Soviet Union over suspected missile sites in Cuba.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Racial tensions in the United States weren't as easily deflected. Desegregation of Southern schools pit blacks against whites. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. articulated a message of hope and reason.
I have a dream that one day this nation...
The television set was blaring. A screen was missing from a bedroom window, and there was no sign of their daughter. Deputy Sheriff O.R. McFarlane was one of the first to arrive on the scene.
It was obvious that we had a problem. She was, in fact, missing, and there was some foul play somewhere.
Police found tire tracks on the dirt road near the home, and there was other evidence.
There was a set of boot tracks leading out onto Elder Avenue from the dirt lane. There was a set of barefoot tracks leading back into the lane, and which got in and out of the car that was parked there.
Nearby, police discovered a pair of mismatched workman's gloves and a belt. Robert Good was the first journalist on the scene, covering the story for the Fresno Bee newspaper. Once there, he found more than a story.
Started walking down the bank a ways. I walked 150 feet down the bank, and there she was.
Marlene was floating face down in the reservoir behind the family home. Marlene's brother Walt was searching the area in a police helicopter.
And as we flew over the home, I saw the hearse bullet. And at that time, I knew that Marlene had been found.
The autopsy revealed Marlene had been stabbed in the chest, although the wound was not fatal. There was water in her lungs, so the cause of death was drowning. Marlene's wrists were tied behind her back with a knot used by most area dairy farmers.
It had this little knot in it. It was something you could do very quickly and keep the cow from kicking him.
There were no signs of sexual assault, but bruises on the body suggested Marlene bravely fought her attacker. In a search for witnesses, one of Marlene's high school classmates told police he saw a strange car near Marlene's house around the time of her murder.
He said it was aqua-type blue fenders. He liked the paint on the car. Black on the hood and black on the top and black clear down the trunk. High school kid, it kind of, 53 Plymouth looked pretty good to him.
Police had tire impressions at the crime scene and a description of the car. Now, all they had to do was find it. A witness saw a 1953 black and turquoise Plymouth parked near Marlene Miller's home on the night of her murder. Within hours, police found it.
I remember Hanford Police Department came up with a car of that description parked in front of the Royal Hotel in downtown Hanford on 7th Street.
When Deputy Sheriff McFarlane peered inside the rear window, he saw what would later become a crucial piece of evidence.
I could see a pair of boots back there. One was sitting flat and the other was on its side. And with a flashlight I could see the tread. Looked to me like the same tread that was out there in Tome Lane.
The car was registered to Booker T. Hillary, Jr., a local dairy worker who had recently been released from prison for a previous rape conviction. One of his co-workers told police that he saw Hillary driving towards Marlene Miller's home after work on the night of her murder. And Hillary's employer identified the gloves found at the crime scene as the ones Hillary wore. The tires on Hillary's car and the boots found in the back seat were similar to the tire and boot impressions in the soft mud near the crime scene.
But that doesn't mean that he killed her, even though the gloves were pitched out down the road where the car tracks that looked like his went. So everything was circumstantial. There was no real evidence to put him in the home.
Booker Hillary denied any involvement in Marlene's murder. Hillary said he drove by the Millers' home every day since he worked at the dairy farm just down the road. He said his tire and shoe impressions in the area meant nothing. Booker Hillary was arrested, tried, and convicted of Marlene Miller's murder. He was sentenced to death. Once in prison, Hillary took full advantage of the appellate process and petitioned to have his conviction overturned.
It was discouraging, especially for the family that had to constantly relive this nightmare every time this case would come up.
Each time that we go through this process, I keep thinking that maybe this is the last process that they will have to endure. And they just keep coming and coming.
Frustrating. Sometimes the criminal justice system to a police officer is frustrating. All right?
Every appeal Hillary filed was unsuccessful. But in 1974, the United States Supreme Court ruled the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment. As a result, the sentences of everyone on death row, including Booker Hillary, were commuted to life in prison. The Supreme Court reversed their decision 2 years later, but the commuted death sentences couldn't be reinstated. Booker Hillary's legal maneuvering continued. He appealed his conviction once again, this time claiming that blacks had been excluded from the grand jury that indicted him. In 1983, a judge granted that appeal and ordered Hillary either to be retried or released.
What is disturbing about it is that this was in 1983. The conviction occurred in 1962. And anyone can review the transcripts of the grand jury hearing and determine that, no matter what race you are, you will find probable cause.
Available and found a surprise. In It had been 24 years since Booker T. Hillary was first convicted of Marlene Miller's murder, a conviction later overturned on appeal. Criminalist Gary Kortner examined the physical evidence from the first trial. He started with the boots found in Booker Hillary's car on the night of the murder. The boots had been modified. The soles were the originals from the Wellington Boot Company, but the original white heel had been replaced with a black one.
He did this to keep his shoes from wearing out as fast, and in doing that he made almost an individual shoe out of it because of the two different components.
Kortner compared Hillary's boots to the shoe impression found near Marlene Miller's home. They had the same sole, the same custom heel, and the same 5 individual cut marks in the heel. Next, Kortner compared the tires from Hillary's car to the tire impressions found on the dirt road near the Millers' home.
We were looking for cuts or rocks or anything that had been in the tires. And in this case, we were very lucky because there was a manufacturer's defect that was picked up, and there were 3 cuts in the tires very close to that.
This placed Booker Hillary in the vicinity of the crime scene, but not inside the home. Larry Orth found something important while reading through the transcripts from the first trial. On the night of the murder, 24 years earlier, an alert detective asked Marlene's mother to vacuum the carpet in the living room where her daughter was abducted. At that time, investigators found some unusual microscopic particles in that trace evidence, but they didn't know what they were.
And he said they didn't have the technology to do it other than just to compare them as far as shape, size, and that was it.
The football-shaped particles found in the vacuum cleaner bag still existed in the evidence file and were sent for analysis to an independent forensic lab in Chicago. Skip Palahniuk was the forensic microscopist assigned to the case.
Having done microscopy since I was 8 years old, I had seen particles like this before, and I knew what kinds of physical phenomena produce this.
Under magnification of 300 times, Palahniuk recognized the particles as paint, the kind sprayed from an aerosol can. Throughout the particles were cotton fibers. This explained why the paint particles were round. When paint is sprayed from an aerosol can, the round particles flatten when they hit a surface like wood. When the paint dries, it creates a film-like covering. But if the spray paint hits a fiber, it reacts differently.
If these spheres dry around nothing, they just retain that shape, that is, they're spheres. However, if they come in contact with a fiber, then what happens is capillary forces cause the ends of the sphere, which starts out like this, to draw out where they come in contact with the fiber.
Scientists performed an electron probe microanalysis to identify the elements in the paint.
Every element that's in there has its own X-rays that come off. There are different wavelengths. And we collect these different X-rays at the different wavelengths or different energies. And from their energy or their wavelength, we can tell what elements are present in the sample.
The components were titanium, lead, and iron. An infrared microspectrophotometer, which looks more like a computer than a microscope, determined the paint's molecular composition. The results are charted on a graph, and scientists learned that the paint was an oil-based alkyd with a Prussian blue pigment. Investigators now wanted to know where these mysterious microscopic blue paint particles came from. And they also needed to know how they got onto Marlene Miller's living room carpet 24 years earlier. As prosecutors prepared to retry Booker T. Hillary for the murder of Marlene Miller, they discovered new forensic evidence: microscopic paint particles in the victim's home encased in cotton, But in 1962, at the time of the original trial, the technology to identify these particles didn't exist. But where did these paintballs come from? For answers, investigators looked once more inside Booker Hillary's 1953 Plymouth automobile. Surprisingly, it was still in police custody after all those years. In the forensic lab, scientists noticed that the ceiling of the passenger compartment was lined with a cotton material, and the material had been painted with a blue spray paint.
And pulling some of the headliner off and examining it under the microscope, I realized that there were millions of these things that had been manufactured by him and spraying the headliner. And they were still there. It was kind of like they were there for someone to find, and I was lucky enough to be the one that found them.
Scientists vacuumed the inside of Hillary's car and analyzed the trace evidence. They found thousands of paint particles identical in color, shape, and chemical makeup to those found in Marlene Miller's home.
At the end of all this analysis, what we have are, first of all, green paint spheres. The paint is alkyd enamel. It's the same in both question and known. It has the same color. When you crush up little bits under the microscope, they show the same kinds of crystalline fillers that are inside. The elemental composition is identical. The infrared spectrum showing the molecular composition is identical. They both use Prussian blue.
We couldn't say that it came from the same spray can. We're just saying, how did they get there? They're so unusual in shape. Why are they in both places?
Investigators suspected that Booker Hillary spray painted the interior roof of his car. As he did, the round paint particles attached to the cotton fibers and remained cylindrical as they dried. Driving around town, when Hillary hit a bump in the road, the microscopic particles shed, landing on his clothing and in his hair.
These paintballs just followed him around like a virus, and he didn't know they were there.
Prosecutors believe that when Hillary entered Marlene's home on the night of her murder, those microscopic paint particles dropped onto the Millers' living room floor.
He became literally a walking trace evidence factory.
This evidence placed Booker Hillary inside Marlene's home.
We had everything else outside and a tenth of a mile away, but the paintballs put him in the house. That's how important they are.
In 1986, based on this new forensic evidence, Booker T. Hillary was tried and convicted once again for the murder of 15-year-old Marlene Miller. He was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed, 25 years to life, although the judge made it clear that he would have imposed the death penalty if he had been permitted by law to do so. Ironically, it was Booker Hillary himself who handed investigators the forensic evidence used to convict him. Local authorities had tried to sell his car shortly after his first conviction in the 1960s, but Hillary wouldn't allow it.
He in turn filed a motion in federal court suing the county to stop him from getting rid of the car. He dismissed the case and we decided not to sell it. And thank you, Mr. Hillary.
When I looked up that day in the garage and having seen that spray headliner was just indescribable, I said, this is it. Had he have not saved the car for us, I would have never known where these particles came from.
Today, Booker Hillary is 71 years old. He was denied parole at his most recent hearing in January 2003.
Booker Hillary is where he belongs. He should have been in the gas chamber before this, but for whatever reason, the system didn't take his life, but he is where he belongs. He does not belong back out in society.
Investigators credit the foresight of the late Art Thomas, the Kings County Chief Criminal Deputy, who in 1962 insisted that Marlene's mother vacuumed the living room floor where the abduction took place. He kept that trace evidence in police custody.
That was the key to it, and I know Art knew that was the key to putting him in the house back then. He was an investigator, and he was a damn good cop.
We can do what some people think can only be done in works of fiction. We are, I believe, the living embodiment of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Thorndike and some of these kinds of people, and that we can take this little speck of evidence and literally make it speak.
A young woman walked out of this department store, got into a rental car, and was never seen again. The signature on the rental car agreement was a forgery. Forensic scientists hoped that either the handwriting or the ink from the pen would solve the mystery. Nestled in the hills 60 miles northwest of Los Angeles lies Ventura, California. May 6, 1996 started like most other days for 30-year-old Sherry Daly as she dropped her 2 children off at school. But on this morning, she went shopping before work. Sherry was expected home by noon, but she never returned.
911 dispatch.
My wife brought my boy home at 8:30 this morning, and she's been missing since. What is her first name? Sherry Daly.
Sherry's van was found in the parking lot of a local store. It was unlocked, with her purse and items from the store still inside.
At this point, we're still trying to figure out where'd she go. Thinking that she might be with a relative, or there might be, she might have gone off with some friends for some reason. We didn't know.
Detectives asked the store employees if they had seen anything suspicious. A security guard recalled seeing Sherry in the store earlier that morning.
She stopped and spoke briefly with a friend of hers who was head of security of the department store at that time. And then she went about her business and did some shopping. Checked out. She walked out of the department store and walked over towards her van.
The surveillance camera shows that Sherry left the store at 9:22 a.m.
I mean, Sherry's the backbone of our family, and now she's missing.
Today we're going to try and do the base of Ventura, river bottom.
Friends and family passed out flyers throughout the community. Television and radio reports asked citizens for information.
One volunteer says today reminds him of the day they found another Ventura County missing woman.
Many knew Sherry Daly and her husband Michael since they both grew up in the area.
He was the first real boyfriend she ever had. She was just so much in love with him that she could see nothing else. I mean, the sun rose and set in Mike.
Sherry and Mike had been married for 12 years and had 2 small children. Mike worked as a manager at a grocery store. A background check revealed the couple had a history of marital problems.
We know that he represented to her that he wanted to make a go of the marriage, but his actions did not coincide with his expressed reason for going back to the home.
Why? Friends said Michael had a lover, a woman he worked with who was a former model, Diana Hahn.
He did not keep it a secret. His co-workers knew about it, family members knew about it, and of course Sherry Daly actually learned about it as well.
The day after Sherry's disappearance, investigators decided to question Diana Hahn at her home.
She answered the door in a skimpy outfit, obviously been in bed, and behind her was Michael Daly, just wearing a pair of shorts.
Naturally, police were suspicious.
I wouldn't expect a concerned husband to be at his girlfriend's house while his wife is gone, has disappeared.
Soon, a witness came forward claiming to have seen Sherry Daly in the parking lot and said she appeared to be in some distress. Just a few days after 30-year-old Sherry Daly disappeared, an eyewitness told police she saw Sherry in the store parking lot, and it looked as if she was being arrested.
She was seen by eyewitnesses standing at her van door, opening it, and a woman approached her. Sherry turned around, spoke with her briefly, just exchanged some words, very briefly. Whereupon Sherry turned around, the woman placed handcuffs on Sherry, walked her over to the car, put her into the back of the car as a police officer would.
The person was described as female, wearing a tan pantsuit, blonde hair, and sunglasses.
This didn't resemble Diana Hahn, who was Michael Daly's lover. Hahn was a brunette, and she didn't own a car like the getaway vehicle.
The description was a teal-colored car. That, to me, wasn't a common car color to be seen on the road. So my attitude was, it's got to be a rental.
Detective Burt and his partner visited all of the local car rental agencies in the area.
Skip was asking the lady behind the counter, did Michael Daly rent a car from you folks? And so she gets on the computer and nothing comes up for Michael Daly. And he asks, well, what about a Diana Hahn? And lady goes to the computer and lo and behold, she says, yeah, Diana Hahn rented a car on the 5th, May 5th.
May 5th was the day before Sherry disappeared.
We looked at each other and it was like, ooh.
Diana Hahn denied renting the car, claiming the signature on the rental agreement wasn't hers. Furthermore, no one at the car agency could positively identify Hahn as the person who rented the car. The rental car had recently been returned.
We looked in, you could just look inside the back windows and you could see on the rear floorboard a brownish color in the carpeting.
Forensic scientists performed tests on those brownish stains in the back seat. A phenolphthalein test was positive. It's a chemical reagent that turns red when it comes into contact with the hemoglobin content of blood.
It appeared as though this was an area in which blood had pooled or puddled. An individual sitting in the passenger back seat had been leaning forward and bleeding, producing blood running and dripping into this area on the floor.
Investigators then used luminol to look for blood that may have been cleaned from the car and trunk.
What we were told by the crime lab is that when they luminoled the inside of that car, it lit up like a candle. I mean, there was blood everywhere, on the door panels, up in the headliner, everywhere.
With blood samples from Sherry's parents, forensic scientists concluded that the blood inside the rental car was that of Sherry Daly.
I knew something seriously was wrong because I knew she would never leave her children. I mean, she would never, ever have left her children on her own free will.
And scientists found something else. In the back seat of the car were 5 long pieces of what looked like human hair.
When I examined them microscopically, I found that they weren't hairs at all.
There were unusual arrowhead-shaped designs on the shafts. An infrared spectrometer identified the molecular structure of the strand not as a hair, but a fiber. the type used to make wigs. Was it possible that the woman who abducted Sherry Daly was either in disguise or wasn't a woman at all? 25 days after Sherry Daly's disappearance from a store parking lot, search volunteers found some bones off of a remote road just 3 miles from where Sherry was abducted.
They called about 5:30 that Saturday evening. I want to tell you before it hits the 6 o'clock news, because it's going to hit the news, that we have found the remains of a woman. And he said Kristen was Sherry's friend. Kristen has positively identified the clothes as being Sherry's.
Sherry Daly's dental records were already on hand for identification purposes.
The correlation between the dental x-rays, I felt at the time, sufficient enough to tell the investigators that even without me taking x-rays of the human remains, that the remains were of Sherry Daly.
And forensic scientists were also able to determine the cause of death.
Forensics experts at the crime lab were able to map out the different stab wounds, the different tears in Sherry's shirt, indicating that there were multiple stab wounds, more in fact than were located in the bones.
Sherry suffered a devastating attack.
There was in the right jaw area a piece of metal that was embedded in the bone that was removed by one of the forensics experts at our crime lab, Jim Roberts.
Roberts analyzed the metal fragment using an electron microscope, which produced a three-dimensional image and a picture he could identify.
After some study on the microscopes, we became convinced that it was part of a serrated knife blade, actually the tip of one of the teeth of the serrations.
Sherry's husband, Michael, was one of the two suspects in the murder. He said he was at work at the time of her abduction.
Everything pointed to Diana, and we knew Mike was at work, so he has the alibi of not being the hatchet man.
Michael's mistress, Diana Hahn, was the other suspect. The car used in Sherry Daly's abduction was rented by someone who signed Diana Hahn's name. Hahn denied it was her signature and insisted someone else had rented the car and forged her name. Jack Harris is a forensic document examiner who specializes in handwriting analysis.
So if anyone is going to forge her name, they're going to try to make it look like the signature on a driver's license, and yet this had a very visible difference.
The capital letters on the rental car agreement were noticeably different than Diana Hahn's known signature sample, and the writing also had a different slant.
It's a common way of first step in disguising a signature oftentimes. Well, the question signature on the budget rental agreement had the little letters, and then it went straight out to the right.
Harris then compared the signature on the car rental agreement to signatures Diana Hahn signed 10 years earlier. And in those signatures, Harris found a surprise. Diana Hahn's signatures of a decade earlier were strikingly similar to the signature on the rental car agreement.
Sure enough, every so often she went straight out to the right and didn't curl back again. I concluded that, in my best judgment, she signed the rental agreement and initialed the agreement.
Harris believes that in signing the rental car agreement, Hahn thought she was creating a forgery, but she was unknowingly using her writing style that she had used years earlier. And investigators found more forensic evidence.
A lady that worked at a wig store in Oxnard recognized Diana Hahn as a person who had purchased a wig from her just shortly before Sherry Daly's abduction.
Hahn had paid for the items with a check. Detectives searched Hahn's records and found other checks written shortly before Sherry's disappearance.
The checks were interesting, written in green ink. Not too many people carry a green ink pen in their purse. When Diana Diana Hahn was arrested, she was found in her purse a green ink pen.
Detectives sent the checks and the green pen to a forensic document examiner who specialized in ink analysis.
First tests that I would perform are non-destructive in nature, and they're intended to evaluate the ink formulations, not the pen, but the ink formulations.
The most common technique in ink comparison is to use a video spectral comparator.
What this instrument does is evaluate inks in the ultraviolet, visible, and infrared portion of the spectrum. The theory is if it's the same ink formulation, it should react the same under all conditions examined.
Infrared lighting can identify if two ink samples are the same or different. The spectral comparator showed that the ink on the checks was from the same ink batch as the pen in Diana Hahn's purse. And Diana Hahn's checkbook revealed she had made some other unusual purchases.
Based upon who those checks had been written to, the detectives followed up, went to another department store, and did in fact learn that Diana Hahn had purchased an axe, lighter fluid, matches, sunglasses, various items that would have been used during the abduction.
Diana Hahn was arrested and charged with Sherry Daly's murder. The question now, was Michael Daly involved?
Narcissistic, egotistical, sociopath, total lack of conscience, despicable, disgusting human being.
Witnesses told police they saw a blonde woman abduct Sherry Daly from a department store parking lot. The prime suspect, Diana Hahn, was a brunette. In a search of her home, investigators found evidence that Hahn was a master of disguises.
When we executed a search warrant in her room, we found all kinds of photographs showing her in different get-ups and wigs and in makeup as she posed for its modeling agency. We asked Diana Hahn's mother if she could pick out her daughter in any of these photographs, and her mother started shaking her head no, that this wasn't her daughter.
And Hahn's telephone record showed something curious. Diana and Michael spoke by telephone numerous times immediately before and after the abduction. Based on the telephone calls and the forensic evidence, prosecutors say Diana Hahn rented the car under her own name because rental agencies require a valid ID. When Sherry left the store, Hahn may have posed as a member of law enforcement because witnesses say Sherry was handcuffed and placed into the back seat. At some point, Sherry inevitably recognized Diana and knew her husband and his mistress were going to kill her. She was unsuccessful. Luminol, phenolphthalein, and DNA testing confirmed that Sherry Daly was brutally attacked in Hahn's rental car. The 5 wig fibers confirmed the disguise. Forensic handwriting and ink analysis also revealed that it was Hahn's signature on checks used to purchase the wig and the axe.
You have to be maniacal, you have to be evil, you have to have something inherently vicious inside of you to be able to do what she did to Sherry Daly and to leave those 2 young boys without their mother.
The telephone calls Hahn placed to Michael Daly before and after the murder was evidence of his complicity.
The night that we arrested Michael, we did a search warrant on his home, and on the bed where he and his wife had slept was a full-length pillow that you can get probably through some company where you can actually take somebody's photograph and have it actually printed on this pillow. Well, guess whose face was on the pillow? Diana Hahn's. And that pillow was there while Sherry was still alive.
I still get hurt for the betrayal. I think he betrayed us, and he betrayed Sherry in the worst possible way. And the fact that she loved him and he used that love.
We, the
jury in the above entitled action find Michael Anthony Dally guilty of...
Diana Hahn and Michael Dally were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Church life and upbringing tells me that I should be able to forgive him. Unfortunately, God is going to have to forgive me for the fact that I will never be able to offer that forgiveness to him.
Can you describe Sherry and Diana's relationship?
Not good. They both hated each other. They both wanted me.
Big fat ego. And he sat there and said, I can't help it if two women love me. It's not my fault that two women love me. And I think it was an ego trip.
I think he knew exactly what he was doing throughout this whole case. It was just unfortunate for him that he was stupid.
One thing that I'll never forget about this case is Ken Guess saying, when Sherry and Michael got married, I walked Sherry down the aisle and I left her there and gave my daughter to this man. And this was the man that killed my daughter. And that's something that I'll always remember him saying. And I'm sure it's something that he will never forget. So the forensics in this case was very vital. The handwriting analysis on the checks that Diana Hahn wrote to purchase the items and the implements that she used to murder Sherry, that was key.
We hadn't found Sherry Dalley's blood in the car that Diana Hahn had rented. I don't see how we would have solved the case.